Hey everyone, I'm rather incoherent, and this is Hank Samson. Probably one of the hottest takes for one of the weakest characters in the game. I think a lot of people might disagree with me on this one, but I'm gonna get into it. And let's first start off with the obvious good stuff about Hank. His stat line is incredible. Every character I reviewed so far, I started with calling their stat line bad. Forehead mystics with low foot, characters with 3s across the board, characters with low mythos stats and wasted book. None of that's true for Hank. He's at 1 in book, 5 in fist. He's here to kill and he's great at it. He wasted no points elsewhere. He has 3 and 3 defensively, which I have said sometimes is not great on its own, but is workable and you can get away with it. In Survivor specifically, it's fantastic and great. Sparrow Mask bumps that up to 5/5 and you have basically unlimited charges on a Sparrow Mask, because anytime you fail a test, you're going to get the charges back. Then you have access to cards like Pete and Jessica as allies that will boost these up to 6 fist and 4/4 defensive stats, which becomes 6/6 with the Sparrow Mask, and give you unlimited soak for horror and damage, which is a lot like healing. So he's got ally assets that make him functionally invincible and assets available that make him super mythos resilient, and 5 fist is already great, but being able to boost it to 6 pretty easily is wonderful as well. His stat line is unreal, but his ability is you may be assigned damage or horror dealt to ally assets or other investigators at your location. You in this instance is specifically Hank Samson, not the investigator controlling him, or the player controlling him rather. And as a result, this only goes specifically to Hank. You can't like assign it to your infinite soak assets. And being Tetsuo Mori is not really worth being a character card, but we should finish reading. Reaction: when you would be defeated by damage and or horror, instead heal all of your damage and horror and swap this card with its bonded resolute version either side face up. So when you die on Hank, instead you become a resolute version. You'll have to bear with me as I zoom in on this on Tabletop Sim because it's not available on the database. It's going to change your stats, your soak, and your ability. One version gives you +2 to your book, -1 to your fist, and +1 to your foot. So a net gain of +2 with less in fighting and more in clothing. You still have the text where you can soak with other people, but additionally you can no longer be healed. However, you have the reaction: when 1 or more horror is placed on you, draw 1 card. So it's a draw engine and you have 4/6 to soak. Now while I've read it all out, I don't see any point in discussing this form. Hank is a dedicated fighter. If you want to get clues, pick someone who doesn't start with 1 book and need to die before they get up to 3, which is still a bad number. There's really no reason to pick this unless you're in a scenario where you are terrified of taking 6 horror after you've already died the first time. And even then, I would just pick the better form and hope. Coming over to the version of Hank you will be picking the Warden. It gains 1 to its head and fist, and has all the same text at the top as the other version, but now instead of taking horror and gaining cards, when you take damage you gain 2 resources. Frankly, I think this ability is much worse. I would far rather be drawing cards. Gaining resources after you've already been playing the game long enough to have died is like usually you're past the setup phase. You shouldn't need that money. Additionally, card draw is just generally more valuable even than 2 resources. So coming back to the original investigator card, Hank is pretty straightforward. He doesn't get to have an ability, he just gets an insane stat line. And the stat line is bonkers, it's absolutely crazy. But it's worth noting that not having an ability is a big downside. That came up a lot when we were talking about F tier characters. So what's his deck building? First, it is just going to be a less efficient deck because you have to add 5 extra cards. Your deck has 1/7 more chaff that you didn't originally want to run, and anything that you have to be consistent with, like your fighter weapons, will be needing more backups than you otherwise would run. He does get Survivor 0 to 5, but the rest of his card pool is just 10 and 8 and or Spirits 0 to 2, which is sort of edging in on Silas and Calvin's card pools and just feels a little bit weird. I don't understand his card pool is how I would describe that. But coming over to a Hank deck, you can see that he has some pretty strong splash available to him. Sweeping Kick is a wonderful action compression for a fighter, giving characters that otherwise would struggle to dodge the ability to do so. Ward of Protection is a generically valuable card. Quick Thinking is very strong, same with Strong Armed. But the rest of the deck has to make do with being a red fighter. And unfortunately for Hank, being a veritably mono red fighter is a rough place to live. You can get a little bit more action compression than this. You can do something like spend some more experience adding Reastrad to the deck, which is a action compression event he has action available to, where you put some curses in the bag, but you swing for 4 once. And that is maybe worth running in Hank, I don't really know. But the only form of action compression Hank is really getting is a little bit of damage from skills. He has a really hard time doing anything outside of red for action compression, and as a card pool, when you look at red, what they excel at is drawing and surviving. They have so many cards like Sparrow Mask, the Pacitest, Lucky to convert a failure to a success. They have cards that mitigate failures like Take Heart. They have tons of draw like Unrelenting and at Crossroads. They have cards that make you functionally invincible like Jessica and Pete. They have tons of things that are really, really valuable in Survivor, but what they don't have is good weapons, man. Survivors don't have great ways of just investigating or dealing damage. They have ways that are, generally speaking, below rate. The Fire Extinguisher dealing +1 damage, so 2 damage for +1 fist, is like what you get out of a machete, but with no conditions, and in a way, that's good, maybe even worth 3 experience. And the fact that it costs less, also very good, very in line with Survivor. But as the party's main fighter, if you're just swinging a Fire Extinguisher 3 times in a turn, that's nowhere near enough. You have to have a higher top end than that. With a 35 card deck and only a couple of cards giving a little bit of action compression, as a fighter, he really struggles. When you compare him to somebody like a Yorick, somebody who is using Short Supply plus Safeguard and really reliably getting the action compression out of that, somebody who's using Survival Knives and getting bonus attack actions every round, Guard Dogs for testless damage, it's night and day how much more Hank Samson struggles to just get to the enemies and kill them than a fighter that has good action compression. And this is the endgame version of the deck. The reason I'm showing you this, and I'm not going to show you a starter, I'm not going to show you a core, is because this is like a final deck. You can't really put much more in the deck than this. And even when he has Time Worn ran out in all of his assets, my man is just swinging for 2 damage. Hank does not have access to a card pool that allows him action compression. He just doesn't. He has to play fighter, and if we're talking mono red fighter, even with the little bit of help that Hank is getting, it's also being made less relevant by his thinner deck. Hank is in D tier because he's a red fighter that gets nothing from his card pool to fix the inherent problem. To break out of D tier as a red fighter, you either need a card pool that fixes your lack of action compression or an ability that doubles as action compression. And the fact that Silas is even 5 character slots out of C tier might be hype or might be relying on Flex Dark Horse Silas to carry him, because Silas has a lot of the same problems. The only red fighter anywhere near the top of my tier list is Yorick, because Yorick has access to Guardian 022 and does insane work with that card pool. Yorick's ability is also just like disgusting action compression that can be used to recur testless damage. Meanwhile, Hank Samson has a Fire Extinguisher. That's his method. That's why I shit on Calvin so hard, is because when Calvin has all the stats in the world, he's just Hank. You scale up into just a guy that's going to pass a test on rate. You're going to hit them for 2. And that's fine. Hitting people for 2 is a really important part of being a fighter, but you need to have turns where you do more than that. And every top tier fighter does. Hell, every mid tier fighter does. And I think something you'll notice on this tier list is there's not a fighter in Fine other than Silas. He's the only one, because there's a massive hump a fighter has to get over where before that they're really comparatively shitty, and after that they're comparatively great, and landing below average is really hard for a fighter to do. You either fall way short of it or get above it. And Hank Samson, despite being super mythos resilient, is a character that just hits for 2. That's all he does. And you'll have a couple of turns per game where you hit for 2 a 4th time with quick thinking, or you hit for 3 with strong arms. But with no real ability to recur those things, it's just not nearly impressive enough. Like the death knell for me, at least, is that he has no movement economy. Survivor just doesn't have movement economy outside of track shoes, and as a fighter, part of your job is to follow the Clover around as the Seeker sprints across the map at breakneck speed, and he struggles to do that. Another part of your job is when nobody draws an enemy and someone draws an Acolyte, you walk away and kill the Acolyte, and either wait for the next turn to come back or you come back immediately. And again, no movement economy is making this a little bit harder for Hank. Certain card pools are bad at certain things, and I've talked extensively at this point about how for Mystics, you really don't want to be a main fighter. For a lot of Mystic characters who have to deal with bad damage increments and bad movement abilities, the way they deal with being a bad fighter is by simply being a flex character if the team needs help fighting. But for Hank, who has these same weaknesses, his bad damage increment is that it's only ever fucking 2, and his bad movement tech is pretty much the same deal. there's no bailing. Just like Rita, he's locked in. He's gotta be a survivor fighter. And he is so much better than Rita that it makes, I was wondering if Rita should like be below Marie, because Marie might be traditionally better. And I don't feel good about having Hank in the same tier as Rita. I honestly feel like there's a tremendous gulf between those two characters. Another way I could do that is letting Hank break out a C tier and break into C tier and be the only character there. But I don't feel like he's fine. I stress when I hear we have a Hank as a fighter the same way I stress as a Rita, and maybe that's why they should be in the same tier. That both of these characters create a problem where your other teammates are gonna need to worry about fighting. With Rita, it's because she's not gonna be able to deal with a huge variety of enemies. She's great at dealing with specific, really threatening guys like a Deep Wind Bull, and Hank Samson will absolutely cleave through that guy. But when you draw like multiple enemies in multiple locations at the same point in time because of stuff like acolytes, Hank's gonna start getting behind. And if you keep piling enemies onto that, it's gonna be a problem. If you have a big fuck off boss show up with 15 hit points, Hank's gonna take several turns to grind through him, during which your team does not have a fighter, he's busy. Hank lacks action compression in a really, really meaningful way in the role that needs it the most. Because while cloovers have no shortage of action compression, as long as you get the clues eventually, it doesn't matter. But fighting comes at you in bursts. You have to be able to keep pace with it, and Hank's pace is locked in. It's 2 per action, baby. We're not missing, and we're not dealing more. And a couple of times per scenario, you can deal a little bit more. It's not much. I would probably end up running Reastrad in a Hank deck just so that I have something when I'm falling behind, but I'm probably not gonna end up drawing it in my 35 card deck with like not enough draw to make up for that lack of density. Hank being here is a symptom of how survivor fighting works, in the exact same way that Bob being here is a symptom of how survivor clue finding works. There's a lot of survivors very high in this tier list, but those survivors are using unique abilities and unique card pools to push themselves above their archetype. What Survivor gives you is an incredible base for surviving, for drawing your other cards and for getting through the Mythos phase. But you have to do something outside of the core card pool to get above rate, to gain tempo, and to beat the scenario at least better than other characters do. Hank doesn't. Hank has nothing outside of his card pool for meaningful action compression. He has nothing outside of his card pool for, nothing in his ability rather, for meaningful action compression. His ability is blank to make up for his stats, and then his card pool is just not super impressive, and it leaves him in a really bad spot. And I want to be clear, if they were to print like a weapon on par with Runic Axe for survivors, like straight to A tier, immediately to A tier, right? That's how much he moves up the tier list, except he can't reliably find it, so you have to build a deck around draw, run backpack 2s, and because now we're getting high in experience, he's gonna drop down to like the bottom of B tier, because there are a lot of characters in B tier that need a bunch of experience to get online. But without that weapon, without that action compression, dude's not getting out of D tier. He's just stuck down here with people who feel like they should be so much worse than him, but Hank's card pool just fails him in the same way that Bob's did. And unlike Bob, his stat line is crazy. His ability isn't. But regardless of his lack of ability, Hank's stat line and his ability to just not die thanks to the assets he runs and the card pool he has gets him to the top of D tier. He's comparatively weak. He doesn't have the positive tempo that I associate with strong characters, but he's not at all bad, and it's very, very easy to get through a campaign with Hank, provided someone's helping with the boss, because Hank will be busy for several consecutive turns when the boss shows up. Anyway, that's my rant on survivor fighters just being in a shitty situation in terms of action compression. If you disagree with me, I would love to hear how your Hank gets through huge piles of enemies quickly, what his action compression is, how you think he's able to be built to be genuinely good. Do not even at me about Chainsaw. It's not consistent enough in a normal character. This man has a 35 card deck. Anyway, that's all for now. I've been rather incoherent. Thank you for watching. I appreciate it if you could like, comment, and subscribe. All that stuff really helps the channel out. And speaking of helping the channel out, a massive thank you to everyone supporting me over on Patreon. I'll see you in the next one.